All right, here we go. Well, hello and welcome everyone. Thanks again for joining on this wonderful Tuesday for our third session of your Advanced Certification Preparation Series, Part 3. For those of you who don't know me or haven't been here before, welcome. My name is Christine Bonthius. I'm a Senior Instructional Designer here at Alteryx. Mostly where I like to hang out and work on things is the Alteryx Academy, so you can catch me with interactive lessons and doing live trainings just like this, posting weekly challenges. And if you're lucky enough to join us at Inspire here in a few months in Nashville, I'll be there too. So looking forward to seeing you all there hopefully as well. For today's session, we're going to be talking about the third component of getting ready for that advanced certification exam. Part 3 today is going to be focusing on apps. But before we dive into that content, I want to go ahead and just take care of a few housekeeping items before we jump in. One is that this session is being recorded, so you can come and revisit this when, if you are ready for preparing for that exam and you want to study up on some things again. We will have this available for you on the live training post where you registered for today's call. So give me a day or two to render all this and edit that video, and I'll go ahead and post that up here in another day or two, so that way you can have it. And for anyone that you know of who couldn't be with us today for this particular call, let them know that they can access it there anytime they want. So we'll make that available for you. Because we are recording, I would love if you all could keep yourselves on mute. I love to encourage participation, but I would love to have that in the forms of the Q&A panel in the WebEx or even the chat feature of the WebEx. You can go ahead and submit any questions that you have or anything that you need additional clarification on in either of those two channels, and I will try and keep an eye on it throughout the presentation today. But because we are recording and I want to keep the audio in good integrity, I will ask that you please keep yourselves on mute for today. We have about an hour for today's session, and I anticipate going about 45 minutes to about the whole hour. So that being said, we have plenty of time for questions. So please don't be shy. Let me know if you have anything that you want to ask or need clarification on, again, in that Q&A or the chat feature. I'll keep an eye on it, and as we go through some transitions, I'll try and answer some of those questions that are particularly relevant at that time. Otherwise, at the end, we'll definitely have time for Q&A. So if I don't get to your question during the presentation, stay on the line, and I'll make sure to answer it toward the end there. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. We've got a lot to cover today when it comes to apps. So first I want to go ahead and give you just a brief overview of some of the upcoming trainings that we have, a little peek at the calendar. We're going to go ahead and dive into some of the background, the concepts for today's training. We're going to dive into Designer. We're going to spend quite a bit of time there with some of those interface tools and figuring out how that actually looks to configure with an app. And then some other additional resources that we have in terms of preparation for, again, that advanced exam that you might really find helpful, especially as it relates to creating apps and things like that for some of those questions. So you've probably all been here, but I'll hype it up again, community.alteryx.com. If you registered for today's call, you've probably been here, at least on the Academy site. But if you haven't fully explored the community, I fully encourage you to do so. It's just a wonderful resource, just filled with questions and discussion forums and knowledge-based articles and use cases and networking opportunities and blog articles. There's just so much there, and I wish I could go on and on and on about it. But I highly encourage you to check all of those resources out at community.alteryx.com, and not only just consume the resources, but become an active participant. I think it's a lot of fun when we see people really skill up and really become involved with this community of Alteryx users all around the world. Alteryx Academy is one area I will promote in particular. We've got a lot of training resources there for you, all available for free, which is amazing. We've got interactive lessons, and I'll highlight that today because we have a course specifically on apps, which is a great preparation resource for the concept we're going to be talking about today. We've got live trainings, all the past live trainings. In case you've missed those, we post those all in the live training section of the Academy, so you're always welcome to go and consume those and revisit that content that we make available for you there. Every Monday we post a weekly challenge, which are a lot of fun. This week's is a little tough. It took me a couple of tries to get all the answers there, but it's about picking your FIFA dream team, I guess you could say. It's a lot of fun. It's a great parsing exercise, but we've got weekly challenges on there that cover the gamut of skills from beginner, intermediate to advanced, from making apps to using regex to Calgary databases. We've got it all. So I highly encourage you to get involved there to really practice some of these concepts that we're going to be talking about today as well. And then in bold, of course, is product certification. We currently offer a few different levels, core, advanced, and expert. And if you're here on this call today, it's probably because you're interested in that advanced certification exam and how to be successful on it. So let's go ahead and dive in. But first, just a peek at the calendar here for other live trainings we've got coming up. Next week, we've got another chapter of Born to Solve, which is when typically our other fearless leader, Joe Miller, puts a problem in front of somebody, and it's a really great opportunity to watch that person solve this problem on the fly, right in front of you, just like you. When you get a problem that lands on your desk or comes across your way, you've got to think about that problem. You get to watch that process in action, which I think is really cool. And then we have a very full calendar for April, and I'll highlight in particular the rest of this advanced certification preparation series. You've got parts 4, 5, and 6, the final part, all coming up in April, which is gearing you up for success on your May exam. So keep an eye on the calendar for those, and if you can't make any of those, again, we always record and post them back on the live training, so that way you can have access to those training sessions whenever is convenient for you. All right, background for today's training. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Your mission and why you are here, probably, is because you are getting ready for your advanced certification exam. Past couple of weeks, we've done a few series of this to kind of get you ready for some of those other bigger components of the advanced exam that you didn't necessarily see on the core exam, right? For those of you who've already taken it, you're like, great, I've got those top 20 most 20 frequently used tools in Designer nailed down. I've got it. What else do you have to know for the advanced exam? A big part of this exam is going to be tools like the spatial tool palette and building and creating macros, and today, creating analytic apps and understanding interface tools. So that's the topic that we are on today. And in the next couple of weeks, we've got reporting that you didn't see before on the core, and then stuff like advanced prep and parsing. So be prepared for stuff like regex or some pretty intense expressions and formulas that you may not have used for that core exam in the formula tool, and more advanced parsing as well. So today, creating analytic apps into the stratosphere and beyond. So when we talk about analytic apps, the things that we're going to talk about today in terms of key concepts isn't necessarily how to build an app per se. We're going to talk a lot about some of that backstory about how interface tools work and what can they do. But a lot of these things are going to be in the context of how you might expect to be tested on these items, right? So we're going to talk about, what are analytic apps? What makes an app different from a workflow or a macro or anything like that that you might build? I think that's a really important foundational concept. So we'll start there, and then we'll move on into the actual workflow configuration. Interface tools in particular. What are these things and how might you want to use them? We'll take a couple specific tools as examples, but again, we'll kind of position them in a way that says, okay, what are some things that you might need to know about the configurations of these particular tools that would really lend themselves pretty well to a test question, right? In particular, we're going to be talking quite a bit about the action tool. That comes into play a lot when it comes to creating and building apps and understanding all the different things that can be done when building apps. When you build an app, of course, you configure and customize a user interface. That is one big thing that sets an app apart from any kind of other workflow. So we'll spend a lot of time today in the interface designer about kind of the ins and outs and intricacies of what you can do, again, in that interface designer. And because our whole goal today is how you can be tested on these items, I thought it would be fun to start with a quiz. So what I want to do is I'm going to run these. I think I have 7 or 8 questions that I made for this. I want to go ahead and run these out here now. It's kind of like a pre-test. So go ahead and grab a sheet of paper or grab your laptop real fast and open Notepad or something like that so you can kind of keep track of your answers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show a question on a slide, and I'll give it about 30 to 45 seconds or so on the screen, and go ahead and read the question and write down your answers, kind of like your little pre-test. We'll review the answers at the end. But that 30 to kind of 45 second window is probably pretty similar to how quickly you might be expected to answer those questions on the advanced exam for questions like this. So all these questions that we have here today are all about apps. So I'll go ahead and give you about 10 more seconds or so to grab that paper, grab that pen, pencil, open your laptop, whatever it is, before I go ahead and flash up the first question. Okay, Here we go. Question 1. What is the file extension of an analytic app? You've got about, we'll give people about 30 seconds or so. Write down that answer. You might just want to keep track of these for your own. You can talk about them with your neighbor if you're on the call with somebody else, but kind of a nice little pre-test to see how much you know before going into the rest of today's content. All right, we're ready for question 2. True or false? An action tool is required between interface tools and workflow tools. Next question. Question 3. Select the interface tools that were used to create this app interface. So this is a select multiple. Multiple answers here are correct. Question 4. Which action below cannot be used to update a tool in a workflow? Which of these is not an actual action? Question 5. On which tab or tabs of the interface designer can you reorder elements of the user interface? Which tab or tabs? And it's not cheating if you open Designer and test some of these things out. Remember, that test is all open book. All right, question 6. Which of the following is not a tool in the interface tool palette? Which of these options is not a tool? Question 7. True or false? Interface tools can only be used in analytic apps. And our last question, question 8. Select the statements that are true about apps on the gallery. Which of the below statements are true? Okay, so that's your pretest. So keep those answers safe for now. We will be reviewing these same questions at the end. Not sure, there's really no way to poll, but I hope some of you felt either, there's probably some of you at least on this call that felt either like you knew your stuff. These questions are great, straightforward, great. Today's session for you will just really be a refresher on some of these items. For some of you, if you really did not feel comfortable with some of these questions or you just really didn't know, I'm glad you're here for today's session. And we've got a lot of resources to help get you up to speed so you feel ready to answer these questions in kind of a test environment. So first, let's go ahead and start with the foundational knowledge of what even is an app. Well, all apps really start with the underlying foundation of a workflow. And my golden rule of using apps is you have to start with a workflow that actually works. Interface tools don't make anything better. So really what you're looking at when you're using an app is that the underlying process of maybe some of these user interface elements that you're seeing and you're using, at the heart of it really is just this workflow that you've built. And then what you've done is you've layered on elements of a user interface, like a dialog box to let you say, pick this value from a drop-down menu, use my up and down arrows in a numeric up-down to go ahead and select if I want 10 records to come back, and then maybe output whatever file I want from this. And as an app in the user interface, that's all you see. You don't actually see that underlying workflow. All you see is something like this dialog box, right? So when we're creating an app, we're creating a nice, easy, user-friendly interface to allow someone that person knows Alteryx Designer or not, to easily run and access a workflow and execute a process that you or someone else who's built the underlying workflow has built. Output a result, fantastic. Sometimes they'd never even know they were using Designer. So what actually makes an app an app? Well, first of all, it's that file extension, right? YXWZ. When you create an analytic app in Designer, it's no longer a workflow. It's not a macro. It is an analytic app, and those analytic apps do have a very specific file extension, YXWZ. Fun fact, WZ stands for wizard. When you run in Designer, when you run an app, I'll show you when we actually get in there, but there's a little wand instead of the run button to actually execute and launch the app with the user interface. You have a little wand that you can run. That's your wizard wand because you, my friends, are wizards when it comes to building apps. Another thing that makes an app is that it has that user interface. You don't actually have to go in and work with any tools. You don't actually have to go in and put in a file into an input data tool. You don't actually have to write an expression in a filter. You don't actually have to configure a sample tool. You're only interacting, or your end user anyway, is only interacting with that user interface, those dialog boxes, those text entries, whatever you've configured for them in order to interact with your workflow. One really big advantage of making an app is that a user can execute a workflow without even one having to know how to use a workflow or build a workflow in the first place, but they can really customize this by using their own parameters without, like I said, building an actual expression themselves, or by creating a join or whatever it might be, or choosing how to configure a sort tool. Is that all those kind of parameters that can be configured can be customized to how you want this user to be able to interact with this workflow that you've built. And I think really the true definition of what makes an app is boom, boom, firepower. It's pretty awesome stuff. Just to drive that point home, we'll get in there when it comes in Designer, but that an app truly is a very different type of I'll say product in Designer. It's not a workflow. It's not a macro. It's actually a different type of thing that you are building. It's actually an app, and that comes with its own file extension, right? That's something that you can configure or select, and when you drag an interface tool onto the tool palette, often that is selected for you in your workflow configuration window, which again I'll show you in Designer. User interface. The interface tool palette is a very special tool palette that is used heavily when using or building apps, right? These are the tools that actually enable you to create that user interface, create those drop-down menus, create those text trees. No other tools can really do that for you unless you configure that with your HTML macro SDK, but that's a story for another day. Your interface tool palette is really where it's at. If you've seen this before, fantastic. You're going to recognize some of these tools and things that we're going to be talking about today. If you haven't been here in a while, welcome back. If you've never seen this at all, well, we're opening up a whole new world for you. This is interface tools. They're the kind of black and white tools that are nudged in there right between your spatial, if you have your predictive or your data investigation tool palette pulled up, right in between there. So typically your average core certified person probably isn't using these tools too often, but as advanced users, you definitely should be familiar with the tools that are here in this tool palette. What's kind of confusing about some of these interface tools is that for those of you who are building macros and for those of you who are building apps, you're going to be here in this same tool palette, right? Do you take a look at that? You see the macro input and the macro output tool and the control parameter tool are all here in this same interface tool palette. And when you're building an app, you're probably not using those tools. So when you're building a macro, you are. And one important distinction to make with this, especially this interface tool palette, is that the interface tool palette isn't just for apps. And it's not just for macros, right? This is going to house both of those kinds of tool sets you need. And there's a couple of reasons why. The biggest is because sometimes when you're building a macro, you do put a user interface on that. We didn't cover that if you joined us for our last section of the advanced certification sessions maybe a couple of weeks ago. One big thing we did not get to is the use of interface tools to actually create like a configuration window. So that way you could actually deploy and use this macro like an actual tool. But interface tools can be used with macros, absolutely. More commonly though, you're going to see them used when you're trying to create an app. But it's important to know that all those types of tools for maps and macros, I do that all the time, apps and macros are both housed here in this interface tool palette. Right? So how you might want to use these? Well, an interface tool can be used to, say, update a standard tool. When we talk about those today, I'll talk about them as workflow tools or kind of standard tools. These are tools that you would get from your in-out tool palette or your preparation tool palette, your filters, your sort tools, your sample tools, whatever they might be, right? One thing that you're going to be wanting to use these interface tool palettes for are to be able to say, okay, in my text input tool here at the bottom, I've got a value that says dog. Well, I want to be able to let a user type into a text entry box. I want them to be able to say cat. And I want to substitute dog for cat. Or I want to substitute cat for dog, I guess in this case, in the actual text input. So I need an interface tool to be able to say, hey, user, tell me something that you want to do, and I will find a way to update that value in this particular cell based on the input that you specify, right? So there's a couple of different ways that you can configure user interfaces, and one important thing to be able to distinguish is why you might want to use a certain interface tool in particular. What method actually gives you the right kind of interaction or facilitates the right interaction between your workflow and the actual end user, what they want to do. And I think one really good way to kind of think about this is for yourself. You know, think of the last time you used a mobile app, either for your bank or for your whatever company, or you ordered something online from REI or Etsy or whatever it may have been, right? Think about the different interface elements that you could have chosen on that site, and then what did they actually enable you to do? Well, there's a certain ways that you can allow users to actually enter their own values, either by text entry or maybe selecting dates or putting their location in on a map or selecting kind of a numeric up-down, giving people the ability to specify a numeric value. Or maybe you were asked to make a selection by either by a list box with a multiple selection kind of feature, or maybe you had to use a drop down, or maybe you had to open up kind of a tree interface, right? And then sometimes there may have been elements on the page that opened up other opportunities or closed off other opportunities of a particular decision tree based on if you selected a checkbox or if you selected a particular radio button. You know, kind of think about one of those as like when you order something online and it says, is your shipping address the same as your billing address or something like that? Typically that's a checkbox, right? And if you check the box, you never see the opportunity to fill in your shipping or billing address, vice versa, whichever one it is. But if you don't check the box or you uncheck the box, it opens up a completely different window, right, where you have to fill in your shipping address and then specify your billing address in case they are different. That's a really important element, I think, to think about when we think about these conditionals is how they open up different areas of a workflow to navigate to, or different decisions that can be made in a process based on a little thing that you select. And then, of course, something with dialogue, for example, let's say you didn't actually fill in your street address in that shipping address, right? You're typically going to get some kind of message, usually in red text, or it won't let you proceed until you actually enter in that address, right? So we can actually talk to our user when they don't interact with the workflow in the way that we need them to for it to be successful. So I think being familiar with all of these different types of interface tools and their applications, and why you might want to choose, you know, a text entry over a multiple selection, or even a multiple selection over a drop-down, you know, what limitations or what opportunities are you giving an end user in your workflow development by choosing to use either one of those interface tools? It's a really important thing, I think, to understand for that advanced exam in particular. And of course, inputs, outputs. So how does this actually work, right? When we have this user interface, usually we're being asked to do something, right? Either put in, like in this case, we're putting in a text entry. So how does this text entry, or how does the value that I type in that little text box, how does that actually get relayed to my workflow? Well, there's a couple of different ways that it can do that, right? I can enter in my name. Here I am, Joe Smith, right? And then I can update a couple of different tools. From an interface tool, always note that that bottom anchor coming out of an interface tool is this, it's a black circle with a little white Q right there in the middle. That indicates a question, right? When we talk about these connections or these concepts that can be entered in through interface tools, we call them questions. And questions can be relayed to other action tools, or to different interface tools like a condition tool, or even like an error message tool, for example, or even a standard workflow tool. Some standard workflow tools, specifically those that contain expression editors, so like a formula tool or maybe like a filter tool, for example, tools that have expression editors in them, you can relay that question directly to a tool. And then sometimes it's going to require an action, right? So some tools that don't have expression editors, which I would argue is the majority of tools, certain standard workflow tools like this sample tool, for example, can only accept an action. I can't accept a connection. I can't accept that question that you just passed to me. You have to tell me what to do with it first. So sometimes that has to be relayed through an action tool. That text entry, Joe Smith, for example, is going to be relayed through this action tool. The action tool says, great, I know what this value is. I can see what's coming in. Now, I have to tell this sample tool what to do with it. And I realize the sample tool probably isn't the best example to use for something like a text entry because you can't actually put Joe Smith in the sample tool, but that is besides the point. That action tool is now going to tell that sample tool, hey, I need you to update the number of records that I need you to select. Or, hey, I need you to update that field that we're using for grouping, right, in that different way. And there's a couple different mechanisms that the action tool can actually update information in those standard workflow tools. The action tool is something that you actually do have to configure. And that action tool has a lot, depending on the tool to which it is connected in the standard workflow way. So looking at this, it's this arrow that really matters right here, right? This action tool is connected to which tool in my workflow. That connection is going to determine what you see in this action tool's configuration window. And since I'm here, I need to I meant to pull this up before. That action tool has a lot of different ways that you can update standard tools. Let me pull up my Alteryx help because I do think that the action tools help page gives you a really nice table, and if I may recommend it for your exam, I'd recommend that you have it pulled up in front of you because you might find it really helpful. Help documentation action tool. I apologize, I did not have that pulled up ahead of time. I forgot. Let me pull this over. This action tool can update a lot of other tools, right, in a lot of different ways. You can apply so many different types of different actions. It's astounding, depending on the tool to which it is connected, right? Some certain ones, like you can delete a tool from a workflow. For example, you can enable or disable containers. You can update values in a particular cell. You can update field lists. You can update passwords for certain things, right? But take a look at over here on the right. It depends. You're only going to see the value like update cell or the action type to update a cell if it is connected to a text input tool, right? You're only going to see the action update a trade area tool radius if that numeric up-down tool is connected to a trade area tool. So in this example, right, because it's connected to a sample tool here, or this action tool's window, doesn't have all those different configuration options that might be available to, say, if you were connected to an input data tool, or if you were connected to a render tool, or another spatial tool, right, or a sort tool. It's really dependent. The actions that you have available to you are really dependent on the tool to which it's connected in your standard workflow. And I think that's really important to know and understand. Right? So you might see different values here by updating field lists if you're connected to different tool types. If you're connected to a text input tool, right, you're going to see even more different action types. So having that help documentation page open is really going to help you, I think, on that exam. Now that we have some of the foundations, I want to go ahead and let's jump into Alteryx Designer, and then we're going to go ahead and come back with some PowerPoint going into some things with the interface designer in particular. So let me go ahead and open up this workflow here. And I already have it pre-built. I decided not to go ahead and build today because really today's session is all about review, right? And the different things that we should be prepared to see on an exam. So what you are looking at here is, let me go ahead and close out this so that way it's not quite, it's not in our way. There we go. What you're looking at here is an app, right? An app that we have built. But first and foremost, I want you to notice that this here is a workflow that actually does work, even though it doesn't have any records coming through it at the moment, right? What this is doing is it's taking some animal shelter data and it's filtering by either values. Let's say I want an animal shelter that's based in Colorado, and then it's finding the nearest animal shelters to my specified zip code, right, that I enter in here. And it's sorting the distance from my zip code to finding the closest animal shelters, and then it's sorting those distance, and then it's giving me the 10 nearest animal shelters to me. One important part about when you're designing apps is, again, understanding how you want the user to be able to interact with the app that you have built and where those interactions need to take place. So you can see I've put in a couple here. I've put in an interaction here at this filter tool where I can either give people an option to pick in a drop-down. You can either pick animal shelters that are in Wyoming or in Colorado, right? I'm giving you an option. You pick one. I'm also giving you the opportunity here to provide your zip code. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to manually type in a 5-digit zip code. And then I want to ask you, how many shelters should I find? Should I find you 10 animal shelters? Should I only show you 5? Should I show you 100? How many do you want to see in terms of your results window, right? And then I'm going to show you some results out here. So kind of planning those interaction points is very, very important. So let's first just go ahead and talk about, I picked some of these, a couple of these interface tools for particular reasons. We're going to kind of go into a little bit of a deep dive into these particular tools, the first being a drop-down. Now there's a lot of different ways that, there are so many different interface tools. We're not going to cover them all today, but some of them have some characteristics in common that I'll try and point out. And then I will highlight that our course of interactive lessons really goes into depth as to configuring, I would say, the majority of those interface tools, and certainly the majority of which you're going to see on the exam. So that was a really great place to really learn more and dive in to all those interface tools in particular. So let's go ahead and jump in here to this drop down, right? This drop down, all this is, let me go ahead and I'm going to click my wizard wand so you can see as a user what you are actually looking at here, right? You're looking at this feature right here where I'm asking you to select a state, right? I'm asking you to choose either Colorado or Wyoming, and I'm only giving you 2 options. Let's say your data supports, all 50 states. Well, then you might want to give a drop down for that, or maybe you make a selection for multiple states, whatever you might want to do. But for this, it's a single selection. The user can only pick one. Yes, that is my cat. Yes, that is a real picture of him. That's fun. Configuring that dropdown requires you to think of a couple of different things. One is, how do you want the user to understand what they're being asked to do? And that is in the drop-down tool's actual configuration. You give them instructions, right? You enter the text or the question to be displayed. And nearly every interface tool is going to ask you to do something similar. Otherwise, it's just going to be like, drop-down tool number 2, right? And that's not exceptionally helpful for a lot of people. People need prompting. People need something to do. So you have to give them instructions that prompt them to interact with your app the way that you hope that they do. So in this case, I'm asking you to select a state. That should give you a pretty clear idea that I'm asking you to click that drop-down and make one choice, right? The next thing that they're going to see, right, when they click that drop-down is a list of values. And how they're presented with that list of values is really up to you. So if I click this drop-down for list values, this is where you as an app designer have a lot of authority in terms of how does this list box get populated. Well, is it populated based on do users see maybe a list of field types, like they only see numeric fields, they only see string fields? That could be one way. Or are they actually, is this list that they're seeing being populated from maybe an external source? In which case that external source, like maybe an Excel file or something, has to be configured in a very specific way with name and value fields. Or maybe they're being populated from an upstream tool. Maybe they're being fed in from like an upstream summarize tool or formula tool or whatever it might be, right? But that could be something I get from my workflow in the course of the design. Maybe it's manual, in which case, like this example, they have to be very configured in a very specific way. Or maybe they're coming from any kind of files that are being chosen here in this app, or even external data sets if you are using those, whether that's from Allocate or whether those are geocoders or whatever they might be, right? You do have a lot of options here. This menu is probably important to note, at least here in this drop-down tool, because you do see this in other tools, right? You see this in other tools where you can allow a user to make selections, or you have to populate lists of things, notably that list box tool, which is used for multiple selections of things. So we're not going to get into that tool today, but just know that you're going to see some of these menus that you see in some of these interface tools are used in multiple tool interfaces when you're actually configuring them. Something to note. There are a few ways when you're populating data in these lists or in these dropdowns that do require very specific configurations. And now you can imagine that when I say these require very specific configurations, that probably lends itself so well to some kind of exam question, right? Specifically, this must contain name and value fields. That's a very nitpicky thing that has to be there in order for this tool to work. Or if you're manually setting these fields, these name and value pairs, one per line, is a very specific configuration option that has to be there in order for this tool to work. So you can see here in my properties box with this manually set values configuration selected that I have the name and the value, one per line. And the name and the value pairs, which you can also get from kind of an externally linked data source, like an Excel table, for example, right? When we talk about name and value pairs, what are we talking about? Well, name is the thing that you're actually going to see. Actually, let me double check. Let me run this real fast so you can see it. The name is what you actually see here in the drop-down menu. Now, this value, Colorado or Wyoming, isn't actually what's in my data set, right? When I look in my data set, what do I actually have? I have CO, the state abbreviation for Colorado, and I have WY, the state abbreviation for Wyoming. So in that name value pair, I'm telling it, hey, in the dropdown, you're going to see this. This is its name. But the actual value associated with that name in my data is this value, and I separate them with a colon here, okay? So same kind of things for those name value pairs from your external source or when you're manually setting them, the specific configuration's got to be there in order for this tool to work. Now I want to highlight here, because we're updating a filter tool, we have a couple different ways of updating this. And let me just go ahead and set this back to how you might normally see this in the actual workflow that you build, right? To actually filter this value, you would say state is equal to Colorado, and that's true. And these are all my animal shelters here that are based out in Colorado. Fantastic. So that's how you'd actually build this thing, right? Remember that the user is actually clicking Colorado, but they're relaying the value CO into your expression, which is great because that's how this is going to work. So the filter tool, let's just take a look at this real fast, is interesting for a couple of different reasons. You'll see here that when I drag this filter tool onto the canvas, I'll just do a fresh one so you can see it as an app, it's got two options for how this tool can be updated. Remember how we talked about certain tools that have expression editors in them, like the formula tool, like the filter tool, can accept a question, that connection directly from an interface tool, because it has this question anchor, right? It's got this black circle with that white Q in there to say, yes, I can accept this question. It also comes with an action anchor, right? So that way it can also receive an action from an action tool. It can receive those instructions. And so now you can pick to update this tool in, well, you have two options now, and I'll show you both. So one is to actually go ahead and connect a question anchor to a question anchor directly. And let me just go ahead and I'll delete this and redo it so that way you can see what this does. Is literally all I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag from my queue to my queue, and it's going to say, awesome, I have established a connection here, okay? If I use a queue anchor, I update the value in my expression with the connection number. So when you're using apps and interface tools in your expression editors, you get these really neat things that are called connections from questions that you can use in your expression editors, right? So in addition to all these fields that you have coming in from your upcoming data or constants that you may want to use from your engine, for example, whenever you're using interface tools, these connections that you establish become usable like variables, right? So I could say here that state is equal to this value that's coming in from connection number 1. One downside of using questions in this way in formulas is that you can see quickly, right, that this expression here that I've built, number one isn't actually a value in my data anywhere. So as soon as I run this, I'm not going to get any results coming out when I actually run this workflow and I'm in development and I'm testing this, for example, right? This statement was never evaluated as true. because state equals number 1, everything is false in comparison to that. So that's one downside of sometimes why I choose not to use these particular connections, is because this doesn't work really in action in the course of workflow development. It works with the app interface, but it's not going to work when you're actually testing this kind of thing in Designer. I prefer to use action tools, and that's just me. And I prefer to use them so that way, one, I can use values that are actually real in my tool. So I'll go ahead and change this back to Colorado. But I like it also because I like to be able to see the whole tool configuration and the options that I have that I'm able to change when I use an action tool. So to use an action tool, typically what will happen, let me just delete this so you can see it. If you drag from a queue down to an action tool anchor, what's going to happen is that an action tool is going to automatically populate in there for you, which is great. You could absolutely drag an action tool from your canvas and drag it on in and connect the queue and then connect the action anchors to the actual tool anchors. I find it easier to just drop it right in there. I like action tools because, one, I get a lot of options depending on the tools, like I said, that it's connected to. I get a lot of options on how I want to update this tool. So I'm going to update this value. And then I get to actually work with the whole tool configuration window to select, well, what do I actually want to update in this particular tool? Do I want to update the operand? In this case, yes, I do. Do I want to update an expression, the whole string of the expression, for example? What do I actually want to interact with? So in the case that you're really building out more complex expressions in your filter tool, yeah, this absolutely gives you more freedom, I think, here to really understand what you're doing. It makes debugging a little easier for me, just makes the visibility more comfortable for me. But again, it's all about preference here. So I'm going to go ahead and update my value in the operand and update this value here, right? So those are drop downs. For some other tools that you use in terms of a user interface, you might have different reasons for doing so, right? This text entry tool, for example, again, providing some instructions for your zip code. You've got different configuration options here for setting defaults or masking text for things like passwords. But one thing I want to highlight here, again, are those different action types that you have. Because this action tool is connected to something like a text input tool, be familiar with all the different ways that you have to update that particular tool. You can update a particular cell, so actually selecting the row and column cell which that value should be inserted, or you can update a value, or you can update a value with a formula. You've got a lot of different options here, right? And same with numeric up-downs. Numeric up-downs, again, enter your instructions, and then select how you want that user to be able to interact specifically with this tool, something like a sample tool, right, where you're telling it to pick the first 10 of something, or grow your trade area to 5 miles, or whatever it might be, right? Again, choosing with that action tool how you should be interacting with that specific tool in your workflow. So pretty simple app interface here. One tool that we aren't really going to cover, but I want to point you toward an interactive lesson that does cover this tool in particular, is the error message tool, is a way that you can communicate with your user to say, hey, if you didn't interact with this interface element the way I wanted you to, you're going to get some kind of message from me. And this is where you get to customize, evaluate something, a condition about that interactive or that interface tool in particular. So in this case, this error message tool is saying, hey, is it empty? Is the question, or is that value coming from connection number 1, is it empty? And if it's true, what should I tell my user? I'm going to tell you, if you didn't fill it in, that you have to select a state. Otherwise, this workflow is not going to work, right? So you can put in some safeguards for your users about how they should be working with your app. Now let's talk about some customization here. Pretty simple app here, a couple of different interface elements that we're giving our user to work with. But what's really going to kind of put those finishing touches and really kind of give you that, that level of, I would say, that customization on your app is really going to be with your interface designer. So let's go ahead and open that up. Your interface designer isn't typically open by default, but you can access it here from your view menu interface designer. You can also access it with some of these hotkey combinations, Control Alt D. Mine seems like it's hiding, it's slid out over here, so let me go ahead and expand this. The interface designer has a couple of different windows here. It's got a layout view, a test view, a tree view, and a properties view. And you're going to use these different windows for different things. This layout view, for example, is how you're going to reorder or rearrange or make that layout nice and pretty for your user interface, right? So I could, for example, move some of these interface elements down the line here. So let's say I want to have my user select the state at the end of their experience here in my user interface, or I want to make sure that the number of shelters defined is maybe on another tab, right? So I can create multi-tab kind of experiences here if I want to kind of force my user into these different ways. So this layout tab is going to be really important for reordering, rearranging things, as well as adding those custom elements in terms of boxes or labels or special links or tabs or anything like that, okay? So that is really your layout view, that custom experience, that user experience. This test view is for you, the app developer, right? This test view is how you get to open this up and see what you've done. This is how it's going to look. It's kind of a nice little preview. You can go in here and fill out the app interface just as if you were a user. But the really cool thing about what's going to happen here is that this is where you're going to access debug mode. Debug mode is going to open up a brand new workflow with the elements that you've chosen, with the values that you've put into this user interface. It's going to open up a brand new workflow with those values in it, so you can kind of test or go back and debug. You know, if you see, hey, I'm still getting 100 elements out of my, or 100 animal shelters out of my workflow, I only put in 5. You know, why am I still getting 100 back? Well, this is a really great way to figure out if your sample tool, for example, is actually being updated by this numeric up-down in the way that you think it is. So debug mode, here for you, the app developer and test view. Tree mode is a really interesting, or tree view is a really interesting window because this helps you understand how different questions and actions are connected to each other, right? So if I pick, let's say on this drop down here, select a state, you can see which actions are actually associated to that particular interface element. And in this case, I have 2. I have an error message, remember, because I'm going to safeguard if this a particular error message here, or if this value is empty, I have something to do here, and I also have an update value, an action tool associated with this particular element. Little known fact is that on this window, you actually do have the ability to rearrange elements here in your interface. So if I go back, my drop-down now should be back on the top. So there's a couple different places where you can actually rearrange interface elements. And then finally, this properties window. This is where you have, again, this is kind of like your front end and back end customization, right? You can create a custom help file for this particular app to help a user use your app more successfully or learn more about it. For chained apps, not on the advanced exam, don't worry, but for those of you who are maybe looking ahead for experts, this is another window to check out here. This is how you prompt another app to run after the successful completion of another, so creating that chained, sequenced app experience. You can also show results to your user in that app dialog box. If you don't have anything selected here, your user is simply just going to see nothing. It's going to say like, yay, your app. So make sure to customize that no output files were actually created. And then my favorite part, of course, is to put in a graphic to create a nice custom experience here for your users. Remember and remind them what they're using this for. In this case, for adopting a pet. So with that kind of content, now let's go back and review some of these things. And again, here are some windows here. We covered the interface designer in Designer, which I think is more appropriate, but I will go ahead and flash these slides up real fast so that way they do get recorded, so that way you can see them later. But we're going to go ahead here in just a moment to view your actual quiz questions. So let's go ahead and kind of circle back with those, right? Test view, huzzah, debug mode, entry view, and properties. So many fun things you can do with your apps. So let's go ahead and circle back and review. So grab those answers that you've come back, and I hope with today's content, let's again revisit and make sure that you remember or understand why these questions are, or these answers are the way they are. So for question 1, the file extension of an analytic app is YXWZ. And don't forget that that is configured or can be shown in that workflow configuration window, right, on the left-hand side. YXWZ. WZ stands for wizard. I hope you learned today that an action tool is not required always between interface tools and workflow tools, right? For those tools that have an expression editor in them, you do not actually need an action tool, but you can use an action tool if you do choose to go that route. So that answer is technically false. In this particular question here for this app interface, a couple of different elements were used to create this. Checkbox is right down here at the bottom, right? So if you check this box, you would output a report. You've got drop-downs that you could select, and you've got quite a few numeric up-downs that you could use to configure some of those specifics for your mortgage values, right? What you don't see here are list boxes, which is something that you would use to select multiple things, or a text entry, which would be used for free-form text. Those are not present here. Question 4, which action below cannot be used to update a tool in a workflow? All of these options in A, B, and C are actual actions that can be used to update tools in workflows. And again, for that complete list, I highly encourage you to have this page open, at least while your exam, and review this. But you can see here that updating a summarized tool in particular is not one of those actions that can be taken. Question 5. As we saw, you can reorder elements of the user interface in 2 different places, on layout view and in test view. Tricky, tricky, right? Not just layout view. Question 6, which of the following is not a tool in the interface tool palette? We didn't cover all these tools today, but with some familiarity of that interface tool palette, you'll find that the slider is not actually an interface tool in the designer interface tool palette. We said it briefly, but that is false, that interface tools can only be used in analytic apps. That is not true, because we can also use them in macros to create custom kind of configuration windows. So apps and macros are going to be really your big places where you're going to see interface tools being used. And then finally, question 8. This was kind of a trickier one because we didn't actually talk about the gallery today, but you should be prepared to see questions about the gallery on the exam. And which statements are true? Well, not A, right? A is false. Analytic apps can absolutely be run on the gallery, right? That's one of their huge advantages, is being deployed on the gallery, so people who don't even know Designer can use and access these things. But if you do use apps on the gallery, you need to be aware of a couple things. And one is that some interface tools are not supported for use on the gallery. One in particular, there's a handful of them, maybe like 2 or 3, but the one that's popping out to me right now is, I believe it's the folder browse tool. It does not allow you to navigate different folders or different directories. You can imagine that's kind of a security risk. So that one is not actually accepted for use on the gallery. So you can't use it there. And that any dependencies, like for example, any of those external files that might be used to populate list boxes or drop-down menus, for example, or any other inputs that might be used along the way in the workflow, all need to be accessible on the server, right? So that's something with pathing. We didn't really talk about that today, but I thought it was worthwhile having a question on to kind of make sure that you're thinking about all the different ways that apps can be accessed and deployed. So for today's session, I wanted to point out some really helpful preparation resources specifically about apps. First, always being that advanced certification prep guide that's available for you on that certification page. Definitely check that out and make sure you're checking off all those boxes about things that we've listed that you can and will be tested on. But if you're looking to study, we definitely have live training sessions on analytic app development for the more intermediate user. That's really going to take a deeper dive into actually configuring apps. So for those of you who are looking for a little bit more practice about actually how to build an app, get some mileage under your belt, that would be a great place to start. And then again, that course of interactive lessons all about creating analytic apps goes much more into depth with some of these specific tools, how you might configure them, some of their ins and outs, things like that. I would highly recommend that in terms of preparation. If you want to practice, we do have a few weekly challenges. I didn't list them all here. There's definitely more, but some good ones to practice some of these different interface elements and try some of these things out would be challenges number 5, 57, 79, 153, and like I said, there's definitely more. If you're looking to level up, especially if you're looking ahead for some of the kind of expert certification stuff, there's additional resources in terms of apps on DevSpace, which you can access through the community. Go to Alternation, that tab on the left, and then click that menu and open up DevSpace. There's lots of really cool things people are doing with apps. We've got tons of tool mastery articles. We've got knowledge-based articles, and of course, different blogs about using some of these different applications for apps, things like that. So I hope that was helpful. I'll go ahead and open up some of these. I saw some questions come in. I know I had to cover things really fast, so let me go ahead and just take a look at some of these questions that may have come in while some of you are on the line so I can clarify anything that may have come in. Oh, it looks like my audio went out for a brief moment, but I'm glad it's back. I hope that wasn't too long. Looks like it was about a minute. I'm sorry about that, everyone. Someone wanted to see real fast how I got to that window in Designer to see that it was an app. And let me go ahead and go through that motion again for you. Here in the white space of the canvas, let me go ahead and hide that. If I just click here on the white space of the canvas, and I go over here to my workflow configuration window. In the workflow window here, remember that I can be a couple of different things. I can be a standard workflow, which is just a YXMD file, just a normal workflow, nothing to see here. I can be a macro, so a YXMC file. I can be a batch or a standard or a location optimizer or an iterative macro. And I can also be an app, right? So just to kind of show you, as soon as I open up a brand new workflow, let's say I am a standard workflow, and as soon as I drag on, let's say, a text entry tool, text box, I'm going to drag that onto my canvas. And after that, all my tools are going to have these fun little lightning bolts and stuff on them. And that's because I've turned myself into an app. So the presence of an interface tool will definitely change how your workflow or what your workflow identifies as. And then here's that little, as soon as you are an app, remember, right, you have that little fun wizard wand to actually run the app, not run the workflow. So by running the app, you prompt yourself with this little dialog box, and all of a sudden you're using the app interface. You're not actually running the workflow anymore. So that was a great question. I do know we're a couple of minutes over, so I'll go ahead and I'll be on the line for a few more minutes to take any questions, but for those of you who need to get on with your Tuesday, I completely understand. This will be online for you. Give me about the rest of the day or tomorrow to get this up online for you, and I will post this session so you can revisit it whenever you want. So thanks everyone for joining, really appreciate it. I'll be on the line for a few more minutes for any questions that come in. But otherwise, have a great Tuesday and see you next time.